I think I mentioned this last time, but these last two lessons I have, 11 and 13, we're going to try to do in one class. DJ will have lesson 12, and he'll take, as long as he needs with two classes. And that way we finish at the month. And then the first weekend of next month is our meeting with Brett Hoagland, and then the first Wednesday is a singing night because it's an odd month. I remember that because this month I messed up thinking it was a singing night, and it wasn't. So we'll get a little bit later start on the next quarter, which starts next month, but we're going to try to finish this up in this month. So we'll do that this evening, Lord willing. Before we get started, Mark Webster is going to lead us in a word of prayer.
Our Lord and our God, we humbly come before Thee in prayer at this time. And again, thank You for all the physical and spiritual blessings Thou hast bountifully bestowed us. We again ask You to be with each and every one of us as we are about to study Thy Word, that we may blot out all the cares and concerns of this world and concentrate solely on Thy Word and Thy will, and apply those things to our lives that we may be better Christians in service to You. We'd ask that You be with the speaker this hour, that he may have a better remembrance of the things that he studied, that he may only speak Thy will. Again, I ask You to continue to be with the Hightower family, and we ask that You be with them and comfort them, and as always, we ask You to have her make a full recovery, but Thy will be done. Again, thank You for Christ and all that He did. In His name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right, Matthew chapter 5, a very familiar passage for us about disciples being salt and light. This follows right on the heels of the Beatitudes. The author notes in the book where Jesus ends with the blessedness of those in the kingdom as they're persecuted for righteousness' sake, and that's one of those paradoxes along with the rest of the Beatitudes. Why are we blessed if we're persecuted? It's because we have something to look forward to. The kingdom of God is theirs, and mentions the prophets as a case in point of that. They were persecuted, but they had the hope that Jehovah affords His children. So following that, the fact that we will be looked down upon by the world and despised and rejected, and that's something that Tyler dealt with at length in our last study because it was about being strangers and pilgrims. And the world hates us because it hated him. We're going to have a positive influence as well, and so there's going to be some kind of a balance there. But we are very familiar with this next section. If someone doesn't mind reading Matthew 5:13 through 16, and then we'll get started.
You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. 16?
Yes, sir.
Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven.
Thank you. All right, so in a word, it speaks about our influence. As salt influences food when we put on the food, and as a lamp would influence the room that it's lit in a room of darkness, so we're to have influence on the world. And that really leads us to our first question, which has to do with that second paragraph. What is influence? He gives a little definition for us.
Power to have an effect on others.
Yeah, the power to have an effect on others. And so, is that really something that may happen or may not happen?
Definitely happens.
Okay, it definitely happens. So what would be the distinction we would make with that? Good influence or bad influence? That's what we're controlling. And that's a profound thought to have, is that no matter what, you have an influence on somebody. It may be your friend, it may be your spouse, it may be your kids or your coworkers or whatever it may be, any relationships you can think about, you will have an influence. That's just either going to be positive or it's going to be negative. And so our actions come with a lot of weight. And so obviously we're talking about being a positive influence on the world. But just like salt and light literally are kind of disrupting, you ever put too much salt into something, or you're driving down the highway or old country road at night and someone's got their brights on and they're those high beam LEDs, that can be pretty scary, can't it? Because you can't see anything. And so that's how some of the world's going to react to our influence. It's a good influence if we're following this context, but to them, they're not going to be very comfortable with it. But plenty, by God's will, are going to be receiving it in a positive manner. He mentions Romans 14 and verse 7, get you in a moment, Larry, as an example of us having influence on other people. I honestly don't believe that that's the best use of that passage. When he says no one lives to himself and no one dies to himself, he's talking about we live or die to the Lord. The greater context is about our influence we might have on each other, weaker brethren, and eating of meats and such. But that verse is talking about how what we do, we either do it to the Lord or we don't do it to the Lord. So I thought Matthew 18 might be a good example of this. And it really speaks to a negative influence. But, you can see the same point and invert it. In Matthew 18, Jesus, after answering a dispute about the disciples concerning who's going to be the greatest, and you've got to become his children, he then goes on in verse 6 in Matthew 18 to say, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses. For offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes. People are going to sin. People are going to falter. He's saying, though, you better not be the cause. And so you can do something that would influence someone to take the wrong action or to think the wrong thought. And we could also think about that, like I said, invert it. We could do something that causes someone to take the right action or have the right thought. We're going to have an influence, and so we need to be aware of our actions. Larry, did you have something?
Yeah, as I was studying this lesson and thinking, I was asking myself, letting your light shine, is that a passive activity or is that an active activity? And how I tried to answer it was looking at the early Christians and Jesus and the apostles. Were they letting their light shine in an active way or just kind of passively doing it? And it made me kind of think about this passage and, how bright a light you want to shine, and that seems to be more of an active activity than when you look at the analogy.
Yeah, that's a good example. The lamp doesn't just spontaneously light itself. It's something we do. It is definitely an activity. You may have someone see your light and you didn't know. But you are either shining your light as an active choice or your light's not going to be shining. It's like spiritual growth. You don't just grow by osmosis. You could hear the best sermon you've ever heard in your life, and if you're not engaged, you won't grow from that. You've got to be engaged in it. So like shining your light, it's an active thing that we're involved in. It's purposeful. It's intentional. Yes, Art.
When I think of a positive example of this, I can't think of too many, but I think of a scripture in 1 Timothy 4:16, where it says, take heed to yourself and to the doctrine, continue in them, for in doing this you will save both yourself and those who hear you.
Yeah.
So it's like, just by us following the Bible and doing what we're saying, we're setting an example for people to follow, and that's our active example of seeing something positive come out of it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think we read a passage like Matthew 6 where it talks about don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing and so on and so forth. And we think we got to be kind of like some secret disciple where, be careful that when you're praying at the restaurant, no one knows you're praying. That's not what that's talking about. It's, the way you described it. If you're actively engaged in seeking to do the Lord's will, and that's your focus to glorify Him, someone's going to notice, and that's by God's design. You don't get up and with a megaphone and tell people how strong of a Christian you are, but if you're a strong Christian, it's going to show. That's an excellent passage to see that, Marie.
Well, when you were talking about the light of the world and having a lamp and all of that, I have a little book at home that it said, you may be the light of the world, but you have to turn on the switch. So that's your active part, I think.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. You may be the light of the world. You've got to turn on the switch. We've got to be engaged in that. Scott?
Being a Christian can bring on burdens that the world doesn't have to bother with.
Mm-hmm.
But the blessings are so much more rewarding and so much more than the burdens. And, you can go around being a stick in the mud, mad at everybody, hate the world, Christian, and nobody will want what you got. You know what I mean? You have to, and I'm not saying you have to be the backslapper and the giggler the whole time, but, make people want what you want, what you have.
That's an excellent point. That's what I was thinking about when he talked about light being a warmth and a comfort. Disciples are to live in such a way that others can find comfort, kindness, and warmth, so we're not a stick in the mud. And there is the need for it being genuine, like you're saying. It's not just a manufactured type of a thing. It's going to come across genuine if our faith is genuine, and we need to be sure we're working on that and aware of that as well. Be mindful of our negatives and lows so that we shine forth, the light of Christ even in those moments. That's a great point. All right. Anyone else have anything? I didn't want to miss any hands. He mentions Mark chapter 2 with Jesus. First of all, Acts 10:38. That's actually our second question. Sorry. How does Peter describe Jesus to the household of Cornelius in Acts 10:38? What about doing good? That's what we're supposed to be doing as well, and people are going to be influenced by that. Mark chapter 2 is a text that he referred to in verses 16 and 17, and there we read, when the scribes and Pharisees saw him eating with the tax collectors and sinners, they said to his disciples, "How is it that he eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Now, what's the important distinction we need to make with that kind of a text that the world often doesn't make? When Jesus ate with the tax collectors and the sinners, what was he not doing?
He wasn't approving of them.
Right. He was doing nothing in any way to give an approval to them. If anything, I would imagine some of those tax collectors and sinners were uncomfortable. And I'm sure that not all of them stayed there very long. Certainly he gained people who were of humble spirit, but Jesus was not in the place of sin, involved in the context of an activity of sin. He was eating with them. That says nothing to sinful activity. He wasn't condoning their actions, but what was he being? An influence, a light, salt, a teacher. Tyler?
Yeah, and I don't think that, I know we don't necessarily know for a fact, but it doesn't look like he left eating when he stated this. So those people that he was with, if they didn't know before, they knew how he viewed them at this point. I mean, he's stating in front of them that, and so...
Yeah, in that context.
Obviously, necessarily they would have to infer that they're the sick, and he's the physician.
That's a great point. That's a really good point. They likely would have been in earshot of this, at least at some point in his ministry, saying something like that, so they would have known. I see a hand over here. Yes, Art.
So when we're talking about people, when you're the light of the world, people seeking the light are gonna see by your example. Couldn't you also argue the same thing on the flip side? Like if you're not shining your light, then people who are attracted to staying in the dark, they're gonna be also
Yeah. That's an excellent point. Look at who your friends are and look how the kind of people they are. And, that probably says something about you. Not necessarily that you can't be friendly with people who are worldly because you're trying to win them to Christ, but, that says a lot. Who are you attracting? Yes.
The other thing, he didn't, you've already mentioned it, but he did not go into their environment.
Yes. Yeah.
It said in the verse just before that, in verse 15, that there were tax collectors and sinners, and many were there, and they followed him.
Yeah.
So they were interested in what he said. He done something to make them interested.
Yeah.
That's the difference. You find those people that want to follow what you're doing or saying, that's when you have your influence on them.
Sure.
You don't go to the local club or pub or whatever
Yeah.
to see if you can go win souls. That's not what that's about.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I'm going to go to the bar because I'm going to drink water but have an influence. That's not what Jesus was doing. Not at all. All right, we got to move on. So, very good comments. Appreciate all of that. So, salt first. And he mentions there are literally hundreds of uses of salt. He names a few. He mentions this first being a preservative agent is probably, most agree, what Jesus is talking about here. Text uses flavor. I don't know. Maybe it's general enough to apply many concepts, and Jesus meant it that way. So first, though, salt preserves. It is in a time where there was not refrigeration and such like that. We're very familiar with how meat was preserved as well as other things with a whole lot of salt. And so that kind of is a side point. Now, when we think about the spiritual application, he mentions several contexts of the Old Testament where we saw that a righteous individual preserved a people or could have preserved a people, but there was an absence of righteous men and acted, therefore, as salt on some food or something else to preserve it. In Genesis chapter 18, we have Abraham and Sodom. And what happened there?
He was conversing with the angels on the way to, they were on the way to Sodom, and got it down to 10 righteous people. If there were 10 righteous people left in the city, he probably not destroy it. And obviously there weren't even 10 righteous people in the city.
Right. He went from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10. And God was still saying, just 10, that's all. And I'll preserve the city. And he gives the reason why Abraham does. The men turned away from there and went toward Sodom in verse 22 of Genesis 18. Abraham still stood before the Lord, and Abraham came near and said, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? It's interesting that Abraham is there acting as a mediator between God and those men. And God would spare that city if there were righteous men in it. And we know the end of that account, that there were not. Also in the Old Testament, in 2 Kings 22 and verses 16 through 20, what did King Josiah find? And how did he respond to it? Remember that? Yeah. And were they following what they found in it? No. And how did he react? Tore his clothes, wept, and showed his penitence. And therefore God spared him. He would still judge the nation, but he said, not until you're gone. And so there was one righteous man there that spared because of his saltiness, if you will. Jeremiah chapter 5 and in verse 1, the scripture says, run to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem, see now and know, and seek in her open places if you can find a man, if there is anyone who executes judgment, who seeks the truth, and I will pardon her. And then in Ezekiel 22 as well, there was that idea, and there was none to stand in the gap. And so, as salt preserves, righteousness will preserve. I think that probably if we get down to a more narrow detail of that our preserving power as living according to God's will will be found with individual people we encounter. And in 2 Peter 2 and verse 9, the Scripture says that God has reserved the unrighteousness for judgment, the unrighteous for judgment. He knows how to reserve them for judgment. But then in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 23, it talks about how He preserves the righteous for the day of judgment. He preserves them as being without spot and blameless. And so I think a great application of this is that we are acting as a preserving agent when we bring people to the gospel, because they're spared from the wrath of God. And that comes through, of course, their conversion. I'm not sure how it's going to work in God's decision to destroy the world and come in judgment again, and at what point that's going to happen. And I've heard Christians even speculate as to there were only so many individuals in Genesis 6, and then that's when God destroyed the world. There's no indication of any of that within the New Testament about the second coming of the Lord. And so it's foolish to speculate, but we can preserve souls from the wrath of God through our righteous influence. Secondly, salt gives flavor. And so that's, of course, obvious to us. I want us to notice there in the book, he points out something very important, I think. He says in that first paragraph of this point, its presence in food cannot be ignored. You ever had food that lacked salt or food that was way too salty? It's not, you don't struggle to discern whether this is sweet or it's salty. It is absolutely unavoidable. It can't be ignored. And so that's important. Job 6:6 says, "Can flavorless food be eaten without salt, or is there any taste in the white of an egg?" I like phrases like that in the Bible, things you might not have thought about, but that really makes sense, doesn't it? Any flavor in the white of an egg. You put salt on it, it's a lot better. And so, and it's very distinct, and we need to realize that in our life as well. We're supposed to stand out. Remember in Matthew 6, you don't do it for the sake of being seen by men, but you're going to stand out if you're living righteously, if you're living the way God calls you to live. The distinction then is in your motive. He mentions a few things with that this flavoring concept of salt. Firstly, seasoned speech. Someone read Colossians 4, verses 5 and 6, please. Colossians 4, verses 5 and 6. And then we'll do Galatians 6, too, so someone be ready for that.
Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one.
Okay, thank you. So in this context, we're talking about really evangelism. But even more than just evangelism, it's everyday life. And that's how we need to live our lives, as those who expect to come into contact with other souls, and therefore by our direct efforts to teach them the Word of God, and just by our indirect influence, we are going to be able to win them over to Christ, or we're going to scare them away. Your speech needs to be seasoned with salt. And so what would that look like? I know that's broad, but, give an example of that. What's speech seasoned with salt?
It doesn't change regardless of the circumstance you're in or the situation you find yourself in. Your speech stays the same.
That's an excellent point. Someone will call you on that. I've heard you talking before. Now you're trying to teach me the gospel, but I've heard you talking out of both sides of your mouth before. Your speech betrays you in that way. That's a great point, Randy. Yeah, it's not idle. For every idle word, men will be judged. And so we don't just ramble on. I think we've all, if not just most of us, have made the mistake of just, we're in a talkative mood and we say something that is not what we should have said, and you can't take that back. And people pick up on that kind of stuff. Anything else with that, DJ?
Your motive is to bring them to Christ, not prove them wrong in a way.
Yeah. That's a great point. So it could even be the tone. You may be saying the right things, but you're bearing down on them, bringing down the hammer. That's important too. Also, he mentions bearing burdens. Someone read Galatians 6:2 if you're there.
Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ.
All right. So certainly that's in a context of bearing the burdens of our brethren, but verse 10 talks about also those who are without. And so you're going to have an influence on people if you help them in small ways and significant ways. If you open the door for an old lady or just anyone, or you pay for someone's meal, little things, that's the kind of goodness that we need to be looking for. And that really can set the stage for a receptive heart in preaching the gospel. And then lastly, in that particular point, provide comfort. And so in 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 6, the apostle talks about how they had been comforted in their tribulation. So now I can share that with you. And we've talked plenty of times throughout this book that people are searching. And they don't know where that comfort is, or fulfillment is, or shelter is. And we certainly can provide it for them. Then also, salt creates thirst, which was an interesting point that he added to that. Question number 5 introduces a passage that he did not have in the text of the lesson, Proverbs 22 and verse 1. And the question is, what does Proverbs 22:1 say about the value of our influence? Anybody get that?
Good name above riches.
Yeah. Good name, a good influence, a reputation is better than riches. And certainly that's something that we should pursue. If we've got a good influence on others, that means they see something positive in us, which means they're attracted to it, and they're going to be thirsty for it. And that's kind of his point in this particular text. He says salt must come into contact with a substance in order for it to be influence that substance. We're set aside but not shut off. We're sanctified but not secluded. Remember in 1 Corinthians 5, the command to withdraw from the disorderly. And he said that I wrote to you not to keep company with the sexually immoral. But I wasn't talking about the sexually immoral of this world, because then you would have to go out of the world. If we're going to make people crave the gospel, we've got to be living the gospel around them. And so we're not monks up in the mountain, but we are laborers out in the vineyard, and that's important. All right, let us get to the next point. I'm sorry if you had comments. Maybe something will pop up in a little bit. Light, and so you're the light of the world. He talks about light in the context of Scripture. God is light, and in Him is no darkness at all. Jesus is one who came into the world as the Word, but in John 1 and following in John's Gospel, really the dominant imagery of Christ is as light in the world, and through that light He brings life. Light is associated with truth and with understanding, and darkness is associated with sin and ignorance and the power of Satan. And so when we're talking about light, it's a spiritual light. It talks about knowledge, and of course that influence we're talking about. It talks about righteous deeds. It talks about holiness. All of those things put together, when we're to be light in the Lord, that's what he's talking about. And the first thing that he mentions is that light reveals and illuminates. Someone read Ephesians 5 and verse 13. Ephesians 5:13.
But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light, for whatever makes manifest is light.
Thank you. Combining that with Proverbs 4:19, it says, "The way of the wicked is like darkness. They do not know what makes them stumble." I have caught myself being frustrated with the ignorance of worldly people before. And that's kind of goofy, because worldly people don't know the truth. I mean, they know morality, and they know some rights from wrongs and all that kind of stuff. I understand that. But generally speaking, people just don't. I mean, if you talk to them about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, they're going to think you lost your mind, that that's actually a thing that you're concerned with. And what we're dealing with today in homosexuality and transgenderism, it's completely off the wall to them that we think that that's actually a problem. We're going to waste our time talking about that and trying to convince people of that. They don't know what makes them stumble. How are they going to know? Tell them about Christ's Word. Shine the light. Turn that switch on, right, Marie? You've got to turn the switch on around them as well. Sometimes we turn it off because we don't want to stand out. We've got to shine our light because only then can they know. And we've talked about it several times before in this lesson book is that we're going to be God's answer to people's prayers who are searching for truth and asking for that guidance and truth to come to them and to know the way of salvation. It's going to be coming through disciples making disciples. Secondly, light drives away darkness. And so it's just a different way of describing it. There in Ephesians 5 and verse 11, he says, "Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them." And then in verse 12, he says, "It's shameful even to speak of those things that are done by them in secret, but all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light, for whatever makes manifest is light." Those verses combined are essentially telling us that because we have the truth, we convict those in darkness of their sin, which will cause them shame, so that they can come to the light. That's what it's saying. When he says it's shameful to even speak of those things, I've always thought of it in the way that, we blush to even talk about it. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. I think in this context, though, that being sandwiched in between verse 11 and 13, he's saying when we tell them, they already know what they're doing and they know it's shameful, but when we call them on it and we show the truth, it's going to bring shame to people, especially those obviously with tender hearts still. And that's the point of preaching the gospel: convince, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and teaching. And so we need to drive away the darkness, and shame is the first step. I can't come to be saved unless I first know I need to be saved. I can't get out of shameful actions and conduct unless I know it's shameful and I feel that shame. That's why God created us with a conscience. We need to drive away that darkness. He mentions in John chapter 3 that it drives them away at times, certainly, and they want that darkness, so they run away from the truth. But even then, I was talking to Chris Benefield. He had been studying with a guy, and we talked about how he wasn't receptive to the truth, but both of us understand that it's still a win. The seed was planted, and they, going away from hearing the truth, are forever changed. They're always going to be different because they've rejected the truth. Maybe they'll accept it again, but at least God is glorified in the proclamation of that truth, and a lost soul heard the gospel. So we need to drive away that darkness. It may drive them into the darkness because that's what they love, but now their character is exposed, and that's something that God is trying to affect through His children. Comments or questions on that? Tyler?
I think, in your example, we're talking about Chris, one of the things that we don't often realize that, Jesus Christ encourages us to teach and preach. And I think that when our focus is so much on, bringing that soul to Christ, we don't realize how much it's helping us, whether we ever win that soul or not. If that soul never comes, there's going to be growth in some way. Whatever you're studying, whatever you're trying to teach them, that there's going to be benefits that you may not even realize. It's sad and discouraging sometimes when they don't come around and realizing that it's not you they're rejecting, but there's still growth coming from that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I don't want to embarrass him or anything, but the thing that the guy Chris studied with was caught up in was a really weird thing, and it's something that he had never heard of. I hadn't heard of it, or at least he didn't know as much about it, and I certainly knew nothing about it, and now he does. He encounters that again, he's better for it, and he's prepared, and so that's an excellent point. It drove the darkness away in us if we're trying to shed light on someone else's error or their sin. Thirdly, it gives guidance. Psalm 119, 105. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Those who are in darkness don't know what causes them to stumble. We not only won't stumble, but we know what will cause us to stumble if we're in God's word on a daily basis. And so it gives us guidance. Proverbs 4 and verse 18 is another place that he mentioned. The path of the just is like the shining sun that shines ever brighter into the perfect day. The way of the wicked, it continues, is like darkness. They do not know what makes them stumble. So we need guidance, and that's where we're going to find our guidance from. I know we're moving fast. Number 4, Light warms and comforts. And this is an addition, I think, kind of extending the metaphor, but it is an effective one. As Scott mentioned before, life's hard even when you're a Christian. If anything, it can get harder. But how you deal with those negative circumstances will very much influence the people around us for good or bad. We're supposed to be a people of joy and optimism. And when something bad occurs to us, we either let that joy and optimism shine forth, or we become a hypocrite because we're not really practicing what we preach. That is one of the most difficult trials of our faith, tests of our faith that we can go through. But light not only gives them that illumination of the facts and of sin and error and of righteousness and truth, but it also shows them the benefit of it and attraction to it. Ecclesiastes 11:7, truly the light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun. We need sun. We're very familiar with that and how it helps us, even our moods. Certainly that's the case with the light of the gospel. And then 5, light draws those who want to come out of the darkness. So, eventually, while we turn to John 3, we will get to someone who, once out of the darkness, they don't know they're in the darkness. There's something wrong. They can't put their finger on it, or they're searching for the truth and they know they haven't quite found it. I'm talking to people who claim they have the truth, but I'm seeing the inconsistencies, and they're not talking about what the Bible actually says that I've read. And eventually we're going to reach a person like that, and they don't run away. They obey the gospel. So in John chapter 3 and verse 19, this is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. For everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen, that they have been done in God. Sin-sick souls with honest hearts are going to be attracted to the truth. And it's not our job to judge who those souls are. It's our job to just scatter the seed. Comments or questions on that? Yes, Larry.
I'm sure many of us have been in a cave where it's just pitch black darkness, and how fortunate light is that comes in there, that without it you're just groping around and don't know where you're at, nothing, and then you have a light, and it's like it saves you, you know.
Yeah.
In a situation like that.
Darkness just inherently can be unsettling. Even if you're not necessarily in a context where there's danger, the power goes off in the middle of an ice storm or something, and you're sitting on your couch, you got a fire going in the fireplace. Well, that would be light. So you don't have a fire going in the fireplace. You have an electric fireplace, and it all goes out, but you're still sitting on your couch, but it can be very unsettling. And that light comes on in a context like that. It certainly is comforting. All right. The last section is really just in conclusion with some things that we've gone through a little bit already. But in Matthew 5 and verse 13, what's interesting is that Jesus adds there, if the salt loses its flavor, how then can it be seasoned? It's good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. The New King James Version says, how shall it be seasoned? The ESV says, how shall its saltiness be restored? And the New American Standard Bible, as some of you have, how can it be made salty again? And so, how do you fix bland food? You put salt on it. How do you fix bland salt? I mean, it's the thing that's supposed to solve that problem. And so, you can't bring that back. Now, spiritually speaking, the application is, if you don't act salty when you are to be salt, you'll lose it. If you don't use it, you lose it. In high school, there was a time where I thought I was really getting all these algebraic principles down and all that kind of stuff, and I am afraid of the day when my girls get that age, because I'm going back to school. You don't use it, you lose it. I recently preached from Hebrews chapter 6, and that's really what it's talking about, with the negative slant of, I saw it, and I saw its glory and its positive nature, and I didn't like it anyway, and turned away from it. And so an individual who has taken in the blessings of the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, and they've decided to start living like the world again, that's dangerous. because what's left to season you? And you're certainly not going to season anyone else. We've kind of talked about that to a degree before. One of the examples of that he mentions is Romans chapter 2. You remember that text very well, where the Gentiles act as a light to those in darkness, a teacher of babes, and a guide to the blind, and so on and so forth. What was their problem? The Jews. Yeah, they were hypocrites. They taught don't commit adultery, but they committed adultery. They taught against idolatry, but they robbed temples. And so, or abhorred temples and robbed temples. So you have a necessity of being consistent, of being sincere and unhypocritical. But he also mentions another text that goes kind of along with that, but gets to a deeper implication of it. In 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 21, you don't have to turn there, but the context is Paul bearing the gift to the needy Jews by the Gentiles to Jerusalem. And what he says there in that passage is that we're allowing you to approve of messengers, and we've got all of these notable men of reputation where you can trust they're not going to steal from the treasury, they're not going to take from this, that they're going to give exactly what you're giving. They're going to get exactly what you're giving. And it wasn't that Paul was dishonest. It wasn't that it would have been a sin for Paul to take the money by himself. It says that he was providing honorable things in the sight of all men. And so when you talk about a Christian being in a place that is unsavory or doing something that they may think that it's not a sin in of itself, even if it is, though, and it's not that big of a deal. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. He mentions drinking and dancing and immodest dress and ungodly entertainment. And what you're wanting to do is go out of your way to provide honorable things for all men, to make sure that you're going above and beyond. Someone says, well, when I'm dressing this way, it's really not my problem. It's the person who's having those thoughts problem. That's not providing honorable things in the sight of all men. I'm wanting to go above and beyond. I'm wanting to make sure that I examine my actions before I make them and determine whether anyone in any way is going to be able to see something negative they can pin on me, or that would affect their view of my reputation and my influence on them. And so we do need to be our brother's keeper, as we've studied before, but the keeper of everyone else insofar as what our influence will mean for them. And so we need to go above and beyond and make sure that we are providing for those honorable things. That doesn't just mean sinful activities, but it means making sure that you're being careful in every way that you can. Comments or questions?
If you haven't acted the way you're supposed to with salt around a certain group of people or a friend or two, it's not too late to change.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Now, don't think you can either apologize to them or just change your ways now and be that, gather that salt again and be the light.
Yeah, that's a